Dearest Father in heaven, thank you for bringing us together today around this time of studying your word. Teach us, Lord, that we might learn from you, both now and always. Help us to understand not only the reason for the events in our story, but also why it's included, why you have placed it there for our learning and for our edification. These things, O Lord, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, we are on Genesis chapter 40 and 41, and which is an interesting the interpretation of the dreams. Or half of chapter 41. I think it's through 32. Yeah, where Joseph starts interpreting people's dreams, which is kind of interesting, right? Last week was Potiphar's wife and him getting in trouble, and they threw him in jail. And of course, even in jail, he still succeeded because the Lord caused it, right? Whatever he did, whatever Joseph did there at the end of chapter 39, the Lord made it succeed. All right, well, let's go ahead and read through, at least through chapter 40 first. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. When Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So we've got the chief baker and the, cupbearer. All right. And one night they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We've had dreams, and there was no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cakes on my head, and in the uppermost basket were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you.
I think I like the cupbearers.
On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Pharaoh had interpreted to them, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. All right. So he's interpreting the dreams, cupbearer, cupbearer or cake baker. Which one is he going to... So which one, the meaning was, okay, both of them had like, the cupbearer had three, I saw a vine with three branches come out, right? Was it three branches?
Yeah.
And then out those three branches each had a blossom and a cup and a bunch of grapes. He pressed them into the cup and gave it to Pharaoh. And that was interpreted as to mean that he was going to lift him up out of the pit. That's what he means by lifting your head up. I will lift your head up. He will lift your head up out of the pit. And when he does that, you will once again be the cupbearer. Does everybody know what a cupbearer does?
Drinks the cup so that the Pharaoh doesn't get poisoned?
Like an official taster
Yeah.
is what I would think. Yeah. They had an important, basically they were there to make sure that the cupbearer was to make sure what he was drinking was safe. So he would always test it before he gave it to Pharaoh. Poison was a thing, and that was to protect him. So, so it's fulfilled. He actually is lifted up in 3 days. Pharaoh gives a huge feast, brings both the cupbearer and the baker up, restores the cupbearer to his position, and executes the baker. Kind of cool. I mean, and the baker's like, "Hey, Joseph, yeah, that was a good thing. Well, why don't you prophesy? Tell me what my dream meant." Oh, okay. That's not what I thought. Yeah, it's so we've got that happening. These are the two dreams, and they came true. That's really the most important point here, right? Is these dreams were interpreted and they were true. So let's go on and see Pharaoh's dreams now, okay? After 2 whole years, this is 2 years later, right? The cupbearer totally forgot about Joseph, which is understandable too. But after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, and there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. And a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him the interpretation he interpreted our dreams to us, giving us an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And he interpreted to us, so it came about. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged." Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said that of you, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. and the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are seven years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about." Okay. Interesting, right? We got this situation happening. So Pharaoh's had these 2 dreams, right? And Joseph says something there very, very interesting at the end in verse 32, where he says the doubling, right? And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. That's something you see in Hebrew literature a lot, that the doubling of something actually intensifies it. Not only intensifies it, but it also means it's most certainly going to happen. Does that make sense? It's a poetic structure, especially in you see it in the Psalms, in Isaiah, in Song of Solomon, and several of those the prophecies. Because whenever God doubles it, it's almost always absolutely this is going to happen. God's already determined it. Here's what you have to do. So it's a structure, a grammatical structure that you see in the Hebrew Old Testament. So, and here we have a wonderful interpretation or an example of exactly that. In the poetic books, it's more of an intensifying of the effect, not necessarily, if God, like in Jeremiah where he says, "I'm going to do this," and he says it more than once, call it doubling down on it, it absolutely is going to happen. God's already determined, right? But in the poetic things, when it's talking about praising God, praise God, I'm saying, Psalm 118 is the perfect example, right? Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. There's that the stanza is his steadfast love endures forever. His steadfast love endures forever. It's over and over again. That's the message of that psalm. So you see that happening. So what's the first thing that Joseph confessed before he interpreted his dream to Pharaoh? What's the first thing that Joseph says to Pharaoh before he actually interprets the dreams?
Oh, he said he couldn't do it.
Huh?
He said he couldn't do it. He couldn't interpret it.
He said he could not do it? He could not do it?
Yeah, he said he could not. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to the Pharaoh. "Well, God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires."
Yeah, exactly. I'm not doing anything. I'm not going to exalt myself into some kind of a great person to say that I'm interpreting all these dreams. If God chooses to interpret your dreams and he gives me that interpretation, that's up to God. It's not up to me, which I thought that what a wonderfully humble thing to say. But it's also a wonderful CYA thing to say.
That's what I would think.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. It's not my fault if I can't interpret. I can't do this. This is if God decides to, He'll do it. But so if God, you can blame God, but you can't blame me. It was
You can't kill God, you can kill me.
and I'm not saying it's one or the other. I think it actually is humility. I think it's more humility. I mean, he's been Joseph's been lifted up and thrown down his whole time in Egypt, right? Keeps being lifted up and thrown. Yes.
One really cool interpretation of that I heard once.
Mm-hmm.
This pastor was saying that it's typology of Christ, like being thrown in the pit, it's
Yeah.
like descent to hell, and then pulled out of it. It's like he's resurrected and lifted up and cast into prison. Then you have that same typology again, where he's the right hand of the Pharaoh and everything.
Right.
I just thought that was cool.
Yeah, that is. Did everybody hear that? It's kind of a type of Christ where he's, thrown into the prison. That's, he's not killed yet, but then he's lifted up. It's that humiliation and the exaltation.
Yeah.
It happens over and over again in Joseph's life, which I think is a good interpretation. I think it's a good allegory, if nothing else. It's because what we see in the Old Testament over and over again is a type of Christ being presented over and over again. That this is what the Messiah will do. This is, if you think about it,
Foreshadow written on human history.
yeah, foreshadowing. I mean, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 4. If you remember Isaiah 7, verse 4, behold, the virgin shall, even if you don't want a sign, I'll give you a sign. That's what Elijah says to, isn't that right?
It might be 14, verse 14. Let's see.
I'm pretty sure it's Isaiah 6 or 7, 4.
It's been a long time since I read it.
Right, where, Isaiah is sent to King Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz says, I will not ask and I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. So what we have here is prophecy fulfilled at that time, okay? But it's also a prophecy fulfilled when Jesus happens. Because this actually does happen in Ahaz's courts, that this happens. But we see it happening also with the birth of Christ. So it's like we talked about this morning, right? With Hosea and Gomer his wife, the temple prostitute. God told Hosea to marry her. She leaves and goes back to the temple, and Hosea is bummed, and he goes, and God says, go get her, bring her back. And he has, children by her. And I mean, it still is like the best name of any child in the Old Testament. Lo Ami, not my people. I'm sorry. Or no mercy. And it's actually using Hosea's life, his family, to prophesy about the people of Israel. I'm sorry. I don't know, Lord, please don't do that. But think about Hosea, the obedience that he showed. It's one of those. and the mercy, that the reflection of the mercy of God on the people of Israel. You know, his mercy towards Gomer and God's mercy to the people of Israel. It's I just, Hosea is one of my favorite of the smaller, what they call the minor prophets. Minor meaning short, not necessarily less important.
What's funny is I hadn't remembered the entire story of it,
Mm-hmm.
but I remembered the names.
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty pathetic. So
Yeah.
I had on here, reread Hosea.
Yeah, it's because it's one of those, when you understand what God is doing there, not only furthering his plan, but also showing the people of Israel through the life of his prophet exactly what he has done and continues to do. It continues to do. So the first thing, of course, Joseph confesses is that it's not me. I can't do it. It's only the Lord that can do it. So, and it's interesting, how did Joseph stay in prison further God's plans for Joseph? And how did it further Joseph's preparedness to undertake his mission? That's question number 3 here. How did it further God's plans for Joseph? What do you think?
You mean by him staying in prison?
By being in prison, yeah.
Probably just learn some management techniques.
Okay, good management techniques, but also, had he not been in prison, he wouldn't have met the cupbearer and the baker. They wouldn't have, so there's, God always has his plans. That's, what's the old joke, when we make plans, God laughs.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. But his plans always come to fruition. And it's one of those, it seems like a meandering path that Joseph's on, but it is the path that God has chosen for him. Again, lifting up and crashing down, lifting up and crashing down. So he's there in prison. Remember, he's found favor with the prisoner, with the guard, the prison, or what do you call it, the captain of the guard. So he's now kind of somebody who takes care of these high-profile prisoners. Even though they're prisoners of Pharaoh, Pharaoh's thrown them into the dungeon. It doesn't mean they're, like in the dirtiest, lowest part of the dungeon. They're in the part where they are actually being served by Joseph. So he's serving them. He's learning to serve. He's learning, and he sees them and says, what's troubling you? And then they tell him their dreams, and he says, oh, well, this one means that in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift you up, lift up your head, and he's going to bring you back into the house. And the baker, in 3 days he's going to lift you up. I love that line. And what was it?
More literally.
This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh. I was like, really, Joseph? Yeah, Lord, yeah. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift up your head right into a noose.
That's
That's good. Heads up. So it did indeed further God's plans, because even though the baker's was an unfortunate or a bad outcome, the cupbearers was not. And then, even though he gets out of prison, but he forgets about Joseph until the time is right? Until the fullness of time, if you will. When 2 years later, Pharaoh has these dreams. So again, there's also patience being rewarded there, or being taught. I've told you this story before. The buddy of mine back in Florida that I always hang out with when I go back there, he always said, I don't ever want to pray for patience because I'm afraid God's going to make me wait for it. So. Yeah. So, and my mom said, I remember my mom telling me, don't pray for patience. I'm like, why? She goes, because God will answer it. He'll give you everything in the world to make you impatient.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it teaches Joseph patience, but it also teaches him to wait on the Lord and trust in what the Lord's going to do. It's a matter of trusting in him and waiting upon the Lord's plans. So and Joseph is a steward. He's taking care of the prison. He's taking care of what he needs to be taken care of. So we've got the two dreams now, right? The cow and the grains, and they mean the same thing. What do they mean? It's going to be 7 years of plenty, right? And then 7 years of famine. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because when Joseph, and we'll read this, of course, next week when we read a little bit further, Joseph then is placed in a position of authority in Pharaoh's house, where he's the one that's going to oversee storing the grains, storing what needs to be stored for those 7 years. Don't just get rid of this stuff. We need to store it. We need to make sure. And he will eventually be instrumental in saving the world at that time, at least the world as they knew it there in Egypt. So it's a pretty amazing thing, don't you think? That God is indeed preparing him, and he's answering what God has told him to do. He's answering the call of God, if you will, a divine call. I see Ted looking at me funny.
Yes, because in this part of Genesis, it appeared to me that God told through Joseph to Pharaoh he was going to do 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then the results will be 4, 5, 6. And then he takes Joseph and says, okay, Joseph, I have gotten you in good stead with Pharaoh. So instead of doing 4, 5, 6, you were going 1, 2, 3,
Mm-hmm.
you are now going really against what I had told Pharaoh by storing the grain, so that there may be crop failures, but there won't be famine. So I have sometimes interpretations as to crop failures meaning famine,
Right,
okay, which means the people are starving,
right.
and a crop failure which has been accounted for by God,
Mm-hmm.
so that the people won't starve.
Right. Isn't that amazing how that works? And eventually what you find is that Jacob's brothers come, and we'll see that, or Joseph's brothers come, because they heard, well, Egypt's got grain, has food, so they come out, and then eventually Jacob comes out to Israel, or to Egypt, and the whole family is given the land of Goshen as their, this is where you guys can settle, and they become a great nation under the people of Egypt, which is just amazing to me, It's like, you see how God, and then from there, they become slaves, and then God delivers them out. It's a plan, a movement of history we don't see unless we read the whole thing. Does that make sense? We don't see this movement towards what God is planning on unless you have this idea, this thought process of going, okay, this, then this, then this, and we can see it happening over and over and over again. How God's plan of salvation begins with Adam and Eve. And it starts there, and it seems like he's, over thousands of years, he brings it to fruition in the person and work of Jesus Christ. You want to talk about in it for the long haul, right? But that's what we see here. So we often interpret, of course, Joseph's life and how it turned out. And we judge it, say, Well, he became Pharaoh's right-hand man. Yeah, he went through a lot to get there, but yes, he did. But he was nothing more than a Hebrew slave up until that point. And he was living in a foreign land. Even at Pharaoh's side, he was a foreign slave, a Hebrew slave living in a foreign land. His status wasn't as this great guy. I mean, he did have status because he was Pharaoh's servant, but he didn't have any status in and of himself. He wasn't part of royalty. He wasn't anything like that.
Especially when you consider where it came from.
Yeah,
They found him in the ditch.
yeah. Came up out of the pit. I always think of Psalm 40, right? It's a U2 song too. So. Oh, now I've got to go look at it. I will sing a new song. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. So that's what he does. He lifted Joseph out of the miry bog, out of the pit. And that's what God does in order to make Joseph a prince of Egypt, if you will. Even like he did with Moses, right? Moses was supposed to die. Makes him into a prince of Egypt. Disney even made a movie about it. It was Disney, wasn't it?
DreamWorks.
Was that DreamWorks? That was Steven Spielberg. That makes more sense.
That's why it wasn't horrible.
Yes. It was not horrible. Yeah. Yeah, DreamWorks is, Cats?
At least had God in it.
Yes. Have you ever seen the animated movie Prince of Egypt? It was Steven Spielberg directed it, and it was his production company. It was really well done.
Yeah. Not quite as good as Ten Commandments, but
Yeah. So the big question then is, does God always make clear the course of your life? Does he always make it clear where you're going?
No.
Not always right away.
No. I'll tell you what, I never expected to be in California.
This is California?
Yeah, exactly. I never expected I would move. Hey, and I'll tell you what, I never expected I'd move from Texas to California.
That's kind of the opposite.
And
Of course, you're really not in California. Yes.
we're in Kern County, granted.
California light.
It's Texas, most Texas part of California.
Yeah.
But but God's plan is God's plan. It is I look back on my life and I think, wow, I've had 3 calls in my 24 years in ministry. That's not a lot. I mean, which means I've lasted at each call fairly well. So I knew guys in my class that had 3 parishes in the first 10 years. So that's, and I don't know if that says anything about me, that once I put down roots, I don't want to leave again. But like I said, I never expected to be here. I've told you the story before that I was on a flight out here to visit with everybody, that I was 90% sure I was not going to take the call. And on the flight back, I was 90% sure I was going to take the call. So it's the Lord working in us. It really is the Lord working in our lives.
You never know what he's got planned.
Yep. You
Well, we're
never
glad
can
that you
tell.
made the choice to stay here
Yes.
with it.
What's that?
We're glad you made the choice to stay here with it.
I'm glad too. It wasn't me, it was God, I'll tell you that. Did I ever tell you the story, with Terry, that, after I came out and visited and went back and I talked to Terry about it, after about a week and a half, we went out to lunch, and I said, well, what do you think about this call? And she's like, I think you should take it. And I said, oh, okay. That's pretty much confirming what I was thinking. And I said, well, why didn't you tell me before? She goes, well, you were being all holy and wanting to pray about it and stuff. Wanting the Holy Spirit to guide you. I immediately thought we should go. I'm like, okay.
Guided her to tell you that.
Yeah, I had to ask her.
Oh.
Okay, makes sense. Anyway.
So we can thank Terry.
Well, I was already 90% sure I was coming. She pushed me over the edge. So. Anyway, all right. God never shows us exactly what course our life will take. But, and he never promises that he will. The promise he makes is that he will be with you every step of the way.
Amen.
As Jesus said in, lo, I am with you always to the very end of the age. Very good. All right. Let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Any comments or questions?
Just one, the real miracle in this is the cupbearer.
Yeah.
I mean, he voluntarily went up to Pharaoh and said, let me tell you about this guy. If he was wrong, and it didn't turn out.
Yeah.
Just, he's putting his life in, and it's like, he would have, Pharaoh would have probably whacked him right then and there.
Next to the
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, I don't think if I was a cupbearer, I would have jumped up and said, hey, I can, let me tell you about this. So I probably
Well, you
pushed
got
him
to
in.
see it all become.
Yeah, but still, you knew what happened.
There's something at stake there.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
So I think
God was there too.
behind, yeah, that.
Yeah. God brought it to his remembrance 2 whole years later. 2 whole years later. Very good. All right, let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. God's blessings and peace be with you all.